Welcome to our second feature on nature-based solutions. The term nature-based solutions refers to the harnessing of services provided by natural ecosystems to replace or mitigate the need for other man-made solutions, particularly in respect to climate change. So for example, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and probably to help us adapt to the impacts of climate change. So they involve protecting, restoring, and sustainably managing ecosystems to address societal challenges, to promote human well-being, and to contribute towards conservation of biodiversity. So in this session, we look at how NGOs and government are incorporating and implementing nature-based solutions on the ground to mitigate flooding, diversify community incomes, and even protect coasts. We hear how they identify problems, potential solutions, and experiences in implementation. The session will also discuss the multiple benefits of the nature-based solutions approach and its contribution towards SDG implementation, and even highlight societal co-benefits. So I'm Norizan binti Muhammad Mazlan, Head of Conservation for Peninsular Malaysia in WWF Malaysia. But to shed a light on this subject matter, we have an impressive lineup of individuals. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the names of the speakers, and I will actually introduce the bios right before they speak. So we have 6 speakers today. First speaker will be Ms. Daisy Hassenberger from IUCN. Second speaker is Datuk Haji Ahmad Fazil Abdul Majid from JPSM Forestry, Malaysia. Third speaker will be Mr. Mackenzie Augustine Martin from WWF Malaysia, Sarawak Conservation Program. Fourth speaker will be Mr. Balu Perumal from Malaysian Nature Society. Fifth speaker will be Mr. Faisal Parish. And last is Professor Datuk Dr. Denison Jayasuriya, whom we will be discussing further in terms of the society's perspective. Okay, so I think we've heard already from all the esteemed panelists. Thank you so much. But just to inform, in place of Dr. Daisy and also Mr. Mackenzie Martin, we actually have Raphael Glamet on behalf of Dr. Daisy today, Senior Program Officer at IUCN Asia Regional Office in Bangkok. And we also have Ms. Belinda Lip, Sarawak Conservation Program Lead, and Ms. Alicia Ng, Sarawak Conservation Program Community Education and Engagement Officer. Welcome. So I will proceed straight away to the questions, actually. And we do have several questions from the floor. One of them I will read out, in particular from Encik Nick Zafri bin Abdul Majid. Thank you so much for this question. And I'd like to pose this question actually to Mr. Faisal. Okay, so the question reads, Malaysia does not have a specific flood risk act, unlike the UK or the US. I have been pushing this issue for so many years, but to no avail. So he says that we need a flood risk act of our own to become a benchmark to our flood risk mitigation proposals during preliminary, design, interim, and final stages. So Mr. Faisal, what would you actually say to this, and what's your opinion on having our own flood risk act? How would it help us? Faisal?
I think flood risk management is a key approach that has been developed in the US and UK for a number of years. In fact, the US was one of the first countries when they introduced the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. And this act zones out all of the flood-prone areas in US and provides differential insurance charges depending whether you're living in a high, medium, or low-risk area. And by imposing high charges for insurance, you're effectively discouraging people to undertake development in flood-prone areas and to leave the very frequently flooded areas to a more natural environment or wetland system. In the UK, they have a similar act, but it requires permitting approvals for anyone that wants to develop in or near a river, in or near the coast, in any floodplain area. You need to get special approval from government, and that will look really into the potential impacts. And all of these regulation in US and UK are being adjusted based on the projection of increased flood risk as a result of climate change. So I think clearly this is something we very much need in Malaysia. For the projections of climate change over the next 30 to 50 years, we're going to see much more high rainfall events, much more risk of flooding. So I think the Malaysian government needs to introduce a similar act or regulation which would require and give appropriate incentives and disincentives for development activities in flood-prone area or erosion-prone areas along the coast. We're also faced with such a long coastline in Malaysia, rising sea level, that many areas, we already see it in Klang, being affected by serious coastal flooding. Just last weekend, there were many bunds being overtopped in Selangor and coastal roads being flooded from the big flood events. So I think Malaysia can learn from this overseas experience and use those flood-prone areas as places for nature-based solution to restore back mangrove, swamp forest, and other wetland ecosystem that can absorb flood or coastal sea level rise, and then buffer the surrounding communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Faisal. But we know how water and water resources is very sectoral. People work in silos in Malaysia, right? With this act, which agency do you think, or which agencies actually would be able to enforce the act, first of all? And would it be very similar to integrated river basin management?
I think it's a bit more specific or focused in than integrated river basin management that covers the entire river basin, basically the entire land area. It's more focused on the floodplain and the flood-prone areas, but probably overall you would probably need the National Disaster Committee or National Disaster Council to take the lead, and I think state have their equivalent national disaster councils. But the current setup, institutional setup in Malaysia, is focused on waiting for the disaster and reacting to the disaster. What we need to do, in line with the Hyogo framework at the global level, is to focus on prevention. And disaster prevention would mean to designate those flood-prone areas, discourage development in those areas, restore wetlands and forest in the coast and the floodplain areas to absorb the flood or protect us from storms. And that will need a very high level and strong engagement, not only from federal government, but from the state governments. So it needs key agencies, whether that's the state economic planning units or equivalent in the states, as well as different key land management managers in the state. From a technical point of view, I think the Drainage Irrigation Department, JPS, is a key technical advisor, but they don't have any legislation, so they need to have a clear operating mechanism. And we need to put this in properly in the federal and state regulations for Malaysia.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Faisal. I think this really leads on to the fact that maybe we need to, of course, mainstream. Excellent. Well, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all the panelists and speakers today for this really insightful session. And I hope everyone who is listening is encouraged to consider more nature-based solutions in whatever they do, and take away that it could be far more productive and cost beneficial actually to look into nature-based solutions and not just traditional grey infrastructure. So I'd like to also thank the organizers, the MCCG, and also the IGEM organizers and their partners for this. So that's a wrap. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.